The machine was already on my property when I stepped outside, not parked at the curb, not waiting at the gate, already on my land, a compact excavator idling in the corner of my backyard, a two-man crew setting up to work the morning, still gray and cold off the water. An orange notice was stapled directly to the concrete face of my seawall. Bold black letters, HOA demolition order, aesthetic compliance enforcement. She stood 10 feet from the wall, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky. She didn't turn when I came out. She didn't need to.
The board voted. That eyesore comes down today. We've been more than patient.
No greeting, no acknowledgement that she was standing on my property without my permission. Just a statement, delivered to someone she had already decided didn't matter. "Do you have a county demolition permit?" I asked. "For a permitted coastal structure." She turned then. She had the expression of someone who had never been asked a question she considered worth answering. "We don't need a county permit to enforce HOA bylaws. This is HOA jurisdiction." Said like a period, final, settled. Like the county coastal construction permit I had maintained for 22 years simply didn't exist. I looked past her at the waterline. They had no idea what they were about to do to themselves. The contractor crouched near the first anchor point, running his hand along the wall's base. He was competent. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that nobody on the board, not Karen, not the 5 members who voted for this, not the landscaping consultant they'd brought in to tell them what they wanted to hear, had ever asked an actual coastal engineer what this particular wall was doing. Karen turned back to her clipboard. "Once that wall is gone," she said to no one specifically, more to the morning air, "every homeowner on this block will finally have an unobstructed view of the water. Property values go up. You should be thanking us." I had sent the board 2 letters before this morning, both certified mail return receipt requested. The second carried a licensed coastal civil engineer's professional assessment, 12 pages, explaining in language that required no legal background to understand what would happen to 18 backyards built on compacted fill once the wall came down. Tidal absorption, storm surge, soil loss per cycle. Karen had accepted that second letter at the board meeting. She had set it face down on the table. She had not opened it. Now I watched the crew begin to work, and I understood something with absolute clarity. The HOA hadn't just made a mistake. They had built me a case, piece by piece, and handed it to me, sealed. I didn't argue. I stepped back to my property line, pulled out my phone and pressed record. "I want to state clearly on camera," I said evenly, "that this structure holds County Coastal Construction Permit number 1997-CCP-0214. I have formally objected in writing, twice. Certified mail, return receipt requested. A licensed coastal engineer's assessment was delivered to this board before today. I am not authorizing this demolition. I am documenting it under objection." Karen glanced at my phone. She wasn't concerned. She waved the contractor forward. The first anchor bolt hit the ground at 7:24 in the morning. I kept the camera steady. I recorded the crew working their way down the wall's length, section by section. I recorded Karen making notes with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan that was going exactly as imagined. I recorded the orange demolition order stapled to the face of a county-permitted coastal structure. And when a neighbor walking her dog slowed at the sidewalk and asked what was happening, I recorded Karen's answer. Just a routine aesthetic compliance action. Nothing to worry about. The neighbor looked at me. I kept the camera on Karen. The wall had stood for 22 years. It had absorbed 3 named storms, 2 king tide events, and thousands of ordinary tidal cycles without moving an inch. The compacted fill that 18 backyards were built on, including Karen's, which sat 4 feet lower than mine at the rear grade, had not shifted measurably in over 2 decades. I knew this because I had measured the waterline every season for 22 years. 4 stakes, same reference points, a log I kept in a fireproof box under my desk. I read this shoreline the way a pilot reads instruments. What I had noted at the waterline that morning without the wall's absorption for the first time told me exactly what the first storm of the season was going to find when it arrived. Storm season was 8 weeks out. When the crew finished, Karen photographed what she was already calling the natural shoreline for the HOA newsletter. She looked satisfied, the particular satisfaction of someone who does not yet understand what they have done. I walked to where the wall had been. I photographed the exposed fill grade. I took a waterline reading and wrote the number in my log. Then I drove to the County Coastal Management Office and filed a formal complaint in person attaching every document I had. All of it. Everything. If the board had taken 30 seconds to read the county permit before they ordered that wall cut, they might have noticed whose name was on the coastal engineering assessment attached to it. I bought the property in 2001. The seawall came with it. The previous owner had built it in 1997 under a county coastal construction permit, a proper, engineered structure, concrete and steel, designed specifically for this stretch of shoreline. When I sat down with my real estate attorney before closing, she pointed to it on the survey map and said, "That wall is not an amenity. It is load-bearing infrastructure. You treat it like a foundation, not a fence." I took that seriously. The neighborhood sits on a coastal fill lot land that was built up from reclaimed shoreline in the 1960s and 1970s. That fill is stable when it's protected. Without the wall absorbing tidal pressure and storm surge, a bad storm season strips 5 to 8 feet of soil from the rear grade. The wall was the only thing standing between 18 backyards in that process. I knew this when I bought. I knew it because I asked the right questions before I signed. Over the next 22 years, I maintained that wall the way some men maintain a vehicle they depend on. I reinforced it twice, both times with county permits. I kept every document in a fireproof box. The original 1997 permit, the county-approved reinforcement specs, the inspection sign-offs, and a measurement log. I updated every season at 4 fixed reference points along the waterline. 4 stakes, same locations, same methodology, every cycle. I didn't do it because I was meticulous by nature. I did it because I understood what I owned. Karen did not understand what she was looking at. That was the core of everything that followed. She moved into the community 4 years before the demolition. I don't know her background precisely, but from her behavior on the board, I understood she had some experience in neighborhood associations elsewhere. The kind of person who treats governance as personal curation. Within 18 months of arriving, she had campaigned her way onto the HOA board as chair. Her platform was community beautification, and she ran it with the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Her early moves were small. Mailbox colors, she'd measured several against the approved HOA palette and found them non-compliant by a shade. Grass height, she walked the street with an actual ruler. Holiday decoration windows enforced to the day with reminder notices going out the week before. Petty, technically within the bylaws, and effective. The neighborhood learned quickly that it was easier to comply than to push back. People started trimming early, taking decorations down a day ahead. I watched this happen and said nothing. Mailbox colors are not my fight. The seawall became her project about 2.5 years after she joined the board. She organized what she called a coastal aesthetic committee, 4 board members walking the rear property line, looking at the backyards from the water side. What they saw was my seawall, 12 feet of poured concrete with steel reinforcement, gray, functional, utilitarian by design. Karen described it in the next HOA newsletter as industrial blight, inconsistent with our community's natural coastal character. She had found a clause in the HOA's governing documents, a general provision about unapproved structures materially affecting neighborhood aesthetics. The clause had been written in the late 1980s to address things like oversized storage sheds built too close to property lines, backyard eyesores. It was not written with permitted coastal infrastructure in mind. The people who drafted it almost certainly had no idea what a coastal construction permit was. Karen didn't let that stop her. The HOA sent me a formal written notice 3 years before the demolition. The seawall had been flagged as an unapproved structure in violation of HOA aesthetic guidelines, and I was required to bring it into compliance or face fines. I responded within the week. I sent a copy of the county coastal construction permit, the full engineering documentation attached to it, and a plain letter explaining in 2 paragraphs why the wall existed and what it was protecting. I offered to arrange a meeting with a coastal engineer at my own expense, if the board had questions. The HOA's written response came 12 days later. County permits do not override HOA aesthetic guidelines within the community. Please refer to Section 4.7b of the governing documents. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I filed it. Not because I agreed with it, because a document that wrong in writing with a board signature on it is not something you throw away. She had no idea what she was touching. A mailbox color is recoverable. An aesthetic complaint about a fence is recoverable. What she had decided to reclassify as an unapproved structure was a county-permitted coastal barrier protecting compacted fill that 18 properties were sitting on. She didn't know that. She looked at it and saw something ugly. That was the beginning of the paper trail that would eventually bury her. The HOA called a formal meeting 6 weeks after my response letter. I arrived early. The community room held about 30 folding chairs, and most of them were filled. I recognized nearly every face, neighbors I'd waved to for 2 decades, people who'd borrowed my tools and returned them, people whose children had grown up on this street. Most of them were looking at the floor or at their phones, not at me, not at Karen. That told me everything I needed to know about the temperature in the room. Karen stood at the front with a laptop and a projector. She had prepared materials. Printed photographs of my seawall, enlarged to poster size, were arranged on an easel 3 angles, 3 captions. Industrial eyesore, aesthetic blight, inconsistent with natural coastal character. She had also brought a guest. His name was introduced as a coastal landscape restoration consultant. He was based on his credential sheet, a landscaping contractor who had completed 2 projects near bodies of water. He presented for 12 minutes. His central claim that natural vegetation, beachgrass coastal shrubs, a planted berm, could, over 1 to 2 growing seasons, replicate the protective function of a hard barrier structure. I wrote that phrase down, verbatim. He said it with confidence. He had a PowerPoint. Several neighbors nodded. When Karen opened the floor, I stood up. I kept it to 2 minutes. I didn't use legal terminology. I held up the county coastal construction permit, the original laminated copy I'd kept in my fireproof box, and I said, "This is a county-issued coastal construction permit, number 1997-CCP-0214. It was issued by the County Coastal Management Authority because this stretch of shoreline requires a permitted barrier to protect compacted fill. That permit is still valid. The structure it covers is not an unapproved structure. It is a county-authorized coastal barrier." I paused. The gentleman who just presented is a landscaping contractor. What he described as a functional alternative to this wall, I would invite the board to put that claim in writing and ask a licensed coastal civil engineer to review it. I set the permit on the table where Karen could see it. One board member, a quiet man named Garrett, who sat at the far end of the table, raised his hand. "What's the liability exposure if the wall comes down and there's erosion damage to adjacent properties?" Karen cut across him before he finished the sentence. "We'll address procedural questions after the vote. Thank you, Garrett." Garrett looked at his hands and said nothing further. I stood again. I had a printed letter with me, certified return receipt requested, prepared the night before. "Before this board votes on anything," I said, "I am formally serving written notice. For the HOA record, removal of this county-permitted coastal structure will result in accelerated tidal erosion, affecting all adjacent properties within 2 to 3 storm cycles. I am asking that this letter be entered into the meeting minutes." I handed it directly to Karen. She took it with 2 fingers. She looked at it the same way she had looked at my permit letter months earlier. Then she set it face down on the table in front of her, aligned the edges with the corner, and smoothed it flat with her palm. She did not open it. "This is noted," she said. "The HOA has full authority to enforce aesthetic violations under our governing documents. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $500 per day, beginning 31 days from today. Continued non-compliance will allow the board to place a lien on the property and proceed with remediation at the homeowner's expense. $500 a day." She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, evenly, completely, with the slight emphasis on the words that are meant to land like a door closing. The board voted. 5 in favor of the compliance order, 1 abstention, Garrett, who voted by not voting, which in this case I respected. 0 votes against because I was not a board member. The room cleared quickly after. A few neighbors made eye contact with me on the way out. A couple looked like they wanted to say something. None of them did. That was fine. I didn't need witnesses yet. I needed documents. I drove home. I made 2 phone calls that night, calls I had actually scheduled the previous evening before the meeting, because I had known how the vote was going to go. The first was to a licensed coastal civil engineer whose name I had found through the county's professional registry. The second was to a real estate attorney who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. Neither of them was surprised by what I described. 30 days, $500 a day, a lien if I didn't comply. The board voted 5 to 1. I had 30 days to tear down my own seawall or they'd do it for me and send me the bill. What they didn't know was that I had already made those 2 phone calls before I walked into that room. The first fine arrived on a Tuesday, $500, printed on official HOA letterhead, signed by Karen in a clean, confident hand. I looked at it for a moment, then I wrote a check and mailed it back the same day. Karen had expected me to panic. I could tell by the speed of the letter it arrived 3 days after the meeting, as if urgency alone might collapse my resistance. What she didn't understand was that every fine she sent me was a document. Every check I returned was a timestamp. I wasn't paying to comply. I was building a financial record of exactly how long the HOA had pursued this action against a county-permitted coastal structure. I paid every fine she sent, on time, without comment. While the fines accumulated, something else was happening in the neighborhood. People started coming to my door, not in groups, one at a time in the evenings, some of them glancing toward the street before they knocked. A retired school teacher from 4 houses down, a man who'd lived in the corner property since 1994, a woman whose husband had served on the original HOA board when it was first formed. They came because they had watched Karen's operation for long enough to understand what it was, and because they had things they wanted to say but couldn't say at a board meeting with Karen sitting 12 feet away. Most of what they told me was consistent with what I already suspected. The fines, the letters, the measuring tape on the lawn, they had all learned to absorb it, because fighting back cost more energy than compliance. One man told me he'd repainted his garage door 3 times in 2 years, because Karen kept finding the shade slightly off from the approved sample. He wasn't angry when he said it. He was just tired. But it was the older residents who told me what I actually needed to hear. Margaret was 81 years old. She had lived in the corner house on the waterside since 1983. Before the community was fully developed, before the HOA existed, before the seawall was built. She came to my door on a Wednesday evening with a plate of cookies. She sat on my counter without ceremony, and then sat down at my kitchen table like she had somewhere to be. Before that wall went in, she said, Mrs. Henderson lost 6 feet of backyard in a single storm. It happened twice. The second time, the erosion came within 4 feet of her rear foundation. That's why they built the wall. That's the only reason. I asked if she remembered the year. 1995 for the first storm, 1996 for the second. The wall went in 1997. There hasn't been backyard erosion since. I asked if she'd be willing to put that in writing. She looked at me like I'd asked an obvious question. I've been waiting for someone to ask, she said. I had her statement notarized the following week. The coastal engineer came out on a Thursday morning. His name was Daniel Reyes, licensed by the state, 15 years of practice in coastal construction assessment. His name in the county's professional registry, exactly where I'd found it. He spent 2 hours at the property, walking the wall's length, testing the anchor points, reading the grade differential between my rear lot and the adjacent properties, taking his own waterline measurements against my log. When he was done, he stood at the waterline and looked down the rear property line, the way a doctor looks at a scan. This wall is protecting approximately 18 properties from tidal erosion, he said. Without it, a standard storm surge event will remove significant soil volume from the rear grade of every lot within 2 to 3 cycles. The compacted fill on this stretch is stable only because this structure exists. I asked him to put that in writing. His written assessment came back 12 pages. It was thorough, precise, and written in language a non-engineer could read without difficulty. It said, in plain terms, the seawall is functioning correctly. It is protecting adjacent properties, and its removal will result in measurable and predictable coastal erosion damage. I sent a copy to the HOA board as certified warning letter number 2, return receipt requested. I attached a cover letter that stated clearly, this constitutes formal professional notice from a licensed coastal civil engineer. Removal of this structure will result in accelerated coastal erosion, affecting all adjacent properties on this stretch of shoreline. Karen's written response arrived 8 days later. The board has reviewed your submission. We have consulted our own expert who has confirmed that natural coastal vegetation can adequately fulfill a protective function. The compliance deadline remains in effect. Their own expert, the landscaping contractor, the man with the PowerPoint. I filed Karen's response without comment. Then I contacted the County Coastal Management Office directly. I asked them in writing to confirm the current status of permit number 1997-CCP-0214 and to clarify whether a homeowners association had authority under county coastal management statutes to mandate the removal of a structure covered by a valid county coastal construction permit. Their written response came back in 11 days. 2 paragraphs. The first confirmed the permit was valid and current. The second was the one I had been waiting for. A homeowners association does not have authority under county coastal management statutes to require the demolition or removal of a structure covered by a valid county coastal construction permit. Such authority rests exclusively with the County Coastal Management Authority. I read that sentence twice. Then I made a copy for my files and put the original in the fireproof box with the permit. By the end of that month, I had assembled everything into a single organized package. The original 1997 county permit, Daniel Reyes's 12-page written assessment, the county's written confirmation that HOA had no jurisdiction, certified warning letters 1 and 2 with their return receipts, Margaret's notarized statement, my 22 years of waterline measurements formally compiled and dated, showing the baseline readings that the wall had maintained through 3 named storms and 2 king tide events. Every piece of paper in that package had a date on it. Every date told the same story. I had known, I had warned, I had documented, and they had ignored all of it. I wasn't going to fight them at a board meeting. I wasn't going to fight them in HOA mediation. Every piece of paper I had was going to the county, and then I was going to wait for the ocean to make the rest of the argument. Day 31 arrived on a Thursday. I was already outside when they pulled up. I had set my alarm for 5:30, made coffee, and been standing at my rear property line by 6:15. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted to be there when they arrived, and I wanted them to see that I was there. Karen's SUV came first at 7:10. Then a board member's sedan, then a pickup with a flatbed trailer carrying a compact excavator and a hydraulic concrete breaker. I pressed record before Karen's door opened. She stepped out with her clipboard and looked across the yard at me, standing at my property line, phone in hand. She did not change expression. She had come prepared for exactly this. The contractor climbed down from the flatbed and began unhooking the tie-downs on the excavator. I walked toward him, not Karen. "Excuse me," I said. "Do you have a county demolition permit for this structure? It's covered under County Coastal Construction Permit 1997-CCP-0214. Demolition of a permitted coastal structure requires a separate county-issued demolition permit." He stopped. He looked at his paperwork. He looked at Karen. Karen stepped between us. "We have HOA authorization," she said. "That is sufficient." I kept the phone's steady lens toward her. "HOA authorization is not a county demolition permit," I said. "Those are 2 different documents issued by 2 different authorities with 2 different scopes of jurisdiction." "This is HOA jurisdiction," she said. Same phrase, the one she had used on the morning of the first day I'd ever heard her discuss this wall. I turned slightly so the phone's camera had a clear angle on her face. "I want to state clearly on camera," I said, "that this structure holds County Coastal Construction Permit number 1997-CCP-0214. I have formally objected to this demolition in writing, twice, by certified mail return receipt requested. A licensed coastal civil engineer's written assessment was delivered to this board before today. That assessment stated explicitly that removal of this wall will result in accelerated coastal erosion, affecting all adjacent properties within 2 to 3 storm cycles. I am not authorizing this work. I do not consent. I want that on the record." Karen looked at the camera for one moment. Then she turned to the contractor and said, "Proceed." He looked at me once more. Then he climbed into the excavator. I stepped back to my property line and kept recording. What followed took 4 hours and 11 minutes. I know because the timestamp is on the video file. The hydraulic breaker hit the first section at 7:31 a.m. I stood and documented every stage: the breaking, the cutting of the anchor bolts, the removal of sections and pieces, the exposed soil grade emerging beneath where the wall had stood. Every time the camera angle changed, I narrated the time and location into the audio track. When a section came down and exposed a stretch of raw fill to the waterline, for the first time in 22 years, I photographed it from 3 positions and took a waterline reading against the exposed grade. The number I wrote in my log was higher than any reading I had recorded in 2 decades of measurement. Karen stayed for most of it. She moved around the yard with her clipboard, photographing from different angles, making notes. 2 board members stood near the back fence and talked quietly to each other. At one point, one of them looked at the emerging raw shoreline and then looked away. When the last section came down, Karen stood at the waterline and took a photo of what she was already calling the natural shoreline. She held up her phone and framed the shot carefully, like a person photographing a renovation they were proud of. Then she turned to the remaining crew and the board members and said, "Now every homeowner on this block can enjoy the water the way it was meant to be seen. This is what community standards look like." She said it with the finality of someone closing a chapter. I wrote the quote down in my log, verbatim, with the time. After the crew loaded the excavator back onto the flatbed and left after Karen's SUV turned out of the development's main entrance, I walked to the place where the wall had been. The exposed fill grade was visible along the entire rear boundary line. Where the concrete had stood, the soil was pale and raw and unprotected. The tidal mark on the bare ground was sitting higher than my baseline by nearly 3 inches, and this was a calm morning. No surge, no weather system, a normal low tide cycle. I photographed everything, time-stamped, logged. Then I got in my car and drove to the county coastal management office. I filed the formal complaint in person at the counter, with a staff member who signed and dated the intake form while I watched. I handed over a complete copy of the package I had assembled, demolition photographs with timestamps, the video file on a thumb drive, certified, warning letters 1 and 2 with return receipts, Daniel Reyes's written engineering assessment, and the county's own written confirmation that the HOA had no jurisdiction over a county-permitted coastal structure. The staff member looked at the stack of materials. She looked up at me. "All of this was sent to the HOA before the demolition," she said. "Certified mail," I said. "Return receipt. Twice." She stapled the intake form to the top of the package and handed me my copy. I drove home. I did not feel rage. I felt the particular calm of a man who has done everything correctly and is now waiting for physics to do what physics does. That night I stood at the place where my seawall used to be. The water sat 12 inches below the exposed fill line, the highest reading I had taken at that point without the wall there to absorb it. I checked my weather data. Storm season was 8 weeks out. I closed my log and went inside. 3 weeks after the demolition, Karen threw a party. She called it a shoreline restoration celebration in the HOA newsletter, which arrived in everyone's mailbox on a Wednesday with a photograph on the front page. Karen standing at the rear property line of the common area, arms slightly open, the new natural shoreline visible behind her, a row of freshly planted coastal shrubs in the foreground. The caption read, "Our community's coastal character restored." I kept the newsletter. The event was a Saturday afternoon social. On the rear lawn, folding tables, lemonade, a sign that read, "Welcome to your natural coastline." About 40 people came, most of them because not coming to a Karen-organized event had its own set of consequences. I walked through briefly, said hello to a few neighbors, declined the lemonade, and left after 20 minutes. What I noticed on my way out was the rear grade of the common area lawn. 3 weeks without the wall's absorption, and the soil at the lowest point of the rear slope was already showing a slight depression that hadn't been there before. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. I was always looking for it. The moderate rains came the following week, not a storm. A standard late-season rain event, 2 days of steady coastal precipitation, the kind this area received every year without incident. By the third morning, I walked my property line and took a waterline reading, 3 inches above my pre-demolition baseline, at a normal tide after ordinary rain. The wall had absorbed this exact pressure every cycle for 22 years. The fill was now receiving it directly. I photographed the measurement and logged the number. I didn't mention it to anyone, but others were starting to notice things. The woman who lived 2 properties down from Karen sent me a text, not a call, a text, as if she didn't want a record of her voice, asking if I thought the watermarks on her rear fence posts were seasonal. She'd never had them before. They were sitting about 8 inches above the soil line, a faint mineral tide mark left by standing water that had come settled briefly and receded. I told her to photograph them with a timestamp and keep the photos somewhere she wouldn't lose them. She asked why. I told her it might matter later. Then the county moved. I received a copy of it as the original permit holder, a formal written violation notice from the County Coastal Management Authority, addressed to the HOA board, dated 3 weeks after the demolition. It stated that the demolition had been performed without the required county-issued demolition permit for a county-permitted coastal structure in violation of County Coastal Management Code Section 12.4a. It further stated that the HOA may be held financially responsible for erosion damage to adjacent properties resulting from the unauthorized removal. It was 2 pages, official letterhead, a case number at the top. Karen received the same letter. I know what she did with it because I asked a board member later, not Garrett, a different one, who had started to look uncomfortable at every mention of the shoreline. Karen had forwarded the county letter directly to the HOA's attorney without sharing it with the full board. She had not mentioned it at the next scheduled board meeting. She had not sent it to the community. The attorney's advice, as best as anyone could determine, was to wait and see. That was the strategy. Wait and see. The first significant storm of the season arrived on a Saturday morning in early October. Not a named storm. A coastal low-pressure system that had been tracking up the shoreline for 4 days. The kind of event that generated sustained surge rather than a single dramatic impact. The models had been consistent for 72 hours. I had been watching them. I didn't go outside to check my water line when it hit. I already knew exactly what I'd find. And I knew Karen's backyard sat 4 feet lower than mine at the rear grade. By Sunday morning, 3 neighbors had sent me photographs without being asked. Karen's rear lawn had taken 18 to 22 inches of surge across the unprotected fill line. A 20-foot section of turf at the waterward edge had separated from the soil beneath it, lifted slightly the way carpet lifts when water gets under it. Her rear fence was standing, but the post bases were sitting in standing water that hadn't fully receded by mid-morning. 2 other board members had comparable damage. 4 more community members had rear yards, showing significant saturation and surface erosion along the lower grade. The coastal shrubs Karen had planted as the wall's replacement, the ones her landscaping consultant had testified would replicate the wall's protective function over 1 to 2 growing seasons, had been partially stripped by the surge. The natural plantings had lasted 1 storm season. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Tuesday. I attended. I sat in the 3rd row. I brought a notepad. Her explanation from the front of the room was composed, if strained. This is normal seasonal water behavior. Every coastal property experiences this periodically. The natural plantings will stabilize the shoreline as they establish root systems over the coming growing season. One board member, not Garrett, the other one, who had started to look uncomfortable, raised his hand. "We didn't have this flooding before," he said carefully. "Not in the 15 years I've been here." Karen looked at him. "Coastal hydrology varies year to year. This is within normal range." A neighbor in the 2nd row, a man whose rear fence posts I had seen in one of the photographs, said more quietly, "Why didn't we have this before the wall came down?" Karen moved to the next agenda item. I wrote both questions down. And Karen's non-answers. I photographed the watermarks visible on the community room's exterior wall, left by surge water that had tracked across the parking lot from the rear yards. Then I went home and checked the extended forecast. The first significant storm of the season hit on a Saturday morning. I didn't go out to check my water line. I already knew exactly what I'd find, and I knew Karen's backyard sat 4 feet lower than mine. The second storm hit harder, not a coastal low-pressure system, a proper storm. 3 days of tracking on the weather models sustained surge forecasts that the county coastal office had been publishing since Wednesday. By Friday evening, the county had issued a coastal flooding advisory for this stretch of shoreline. By Saturday morning, the surge had arrived. I was up at 5. I walked my property line in the gray before dawn with a flashlight and took a reading at my temporary erosion barriers, the interlocking sandbag and fabric system I had installed along my own rear grade the week after the demolition permits pulled. Work done correctly. My damage was real. Soil loss at the edges, surface saturation, 2 barrier sections that would need resetting. Manageable. I pointed the flashlight down the property line toward Karen's yard. The rear section of her property was gone, not flooded. Gone. 30 to 40 feet of compacted fill the soil that had been sitting there undisturbed for 50 years because a concrete wall had been absorbing tidal pressure every cycle for 22 of them, stripped away overnight. Her lawn furniture was in the water. Her rear fence had come down. Where her backyard had ended, there was now a raw soil cut bank, dropping directly to the water line. The kind of erosion feature that takes years to stabilize once it starts. The board member 2 properties to my left had lost comparable ground. The board member 3 properties to my right had lost more. 4 other community members had rear yards that were unrecognizable surface soil gone, plantings gone. The coastal shrubs Karen's landscaping consultant had promised would replicate the wall's function, stripped to bare root systems, sitting in exposed wet fill. The natural plantings had lasted 1 storm season. By 7:30 that morning, 3 county coastal management vehicles were parked at the rear access road. The lead inspector's name was Morrison. He was methodical, unhurried, the way people are when they have already reviewed a file and know what they are going to find. He had a clipboard with a case number on it, the same case number that had appeared on the violation notice the county had sent the HOA 6 weeks earlier. He wasn't starting from zero. He had my complaint, my photographs, my video, my warning letters. He had the county's own violation notice that the HOA had received and not acted on. He was here to document what had happened after all of that. I met him at my property line and handed him the complete package in a folder. Original county permit, Daniel Reyes's written engineering assessment, certified warning letters 1 and 2 with return receipts, the county's written confirmation that HOA had no jurisdiction, and my waterline log with the post-demolition readings, marked in red. He went through it page by page. He didn't rush. Then he looked up and asked me one question. Were all of these sent to the HOA before the demolition occurred? Certified mail, I said. Return receipt requested. Twice. The engineer's assessment and the county confirmation letter both went in the same package. He wrote something on his clipboard. Then he walked the rear property line the full length, all 18 lots, with a measuring rod and a camera. The neighbors were already outside. That was the thing about a Saturday morning with 30 to 40 feet of your backyard missing. You didn't stay inside. People were standing at the edges of what remained of their rear lots, looking at the cut banks, looking at the water sitting where their lawns had been, looking at each other. Children were being kept back from the drop. A man I recognized from the emergency HOA meeting was standing at the edge of his property, with both hands at his sides, looking at the water line the way a person looks at something they cannot make sense of. Morrison stopped at Karen's property and measured the cut bank. He photographed it from 4 angles. He wrote the numbers down. Then Karen arrived. She came through the rear access gate with her clipboard, and she stopped when she saw the county vehicles and Morrison's team working the property line. She crossed toward Morrison with the authority of someone who still believed she was the organizing principal of this neighborhood. "This is HOA-managed coastline," she said. "If the county is conducting an assessment, we should have been notified in advance." Morrison looked at her. "Are you a representative of the Homeowners Association board?" "I'm the board chair." He reached into his file and produced a document. He held it so she could see it clearly. "This is the violation notice the county sent to this HOA 6 weeks ago," he said. "Case number 2024-CCA-0881. It notified the board that the demolition of the seawall at this address was performed without a required county demolition permit, in violation of Coastal Management Code Section 12.4a, and that the HOA may be held financially liable for resulting erosion damage to adjacent properties." He paused. "Were you aware of this notice?" Karen's clipboard shifted slightly in her hands. "That matter was referred to our legal counsel," she said. "Were you also made aware," Morrison said, "of a professional engineering assessment submitted to this board prior to the demolition? A written assessment from a licensed coastal civil engineer stating that removal of the seawall would result in accelerated tidal erosion affecting all adjacent properties within 2 to 3 storm cycles." The people standing in their destroyed yards had gone quiet. Karen said, "We consulted our own expert." "Were you made aware of the licensed engineer's assessment?" Morrison said again, the same tone, the same pace. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own answer. From somewhere behind me, the man I had seen standing at the edge of his property said, not loudly. She said it face down on the table. "At the board meeting. I was there." Morrison wrote something on his clipboard. He didn't look up. Karen turned slightly toward the man who had spoken. Then she turned back toward the water. I watched her look at the raw cut bank where her rear yard had been. The soil exposure, the water line sitting where her lawn furniture used to sit, the unobstructed view of the water that was now complete because there was nothing left between her property and the ocean. She didn't say anything. Morrison turned to me. "You filed the formal complaint in person." "October 9th, I said. "I have the intake form with the staff signature and date." I handed him the copy from my folder. He looked at it, confirmed the date against his file, and added it to his stack. One of the board members, not Garrett, the uncomfortable one, who had started asking questions at the emergency meeting, walked over to where Morrison was standing. His voice was quiet, but not steady. "What does this mean for the board members who voted?" he said, personally. Morrison looked at him. "The county investigation will determine liability. What I can tell you is that if board members received professional written notice of potential damage to adjacent properties prior to voting, that documentation will be part of the record." The man nodded once. Then he walked back to what remained of his rear yard and took out his phone. I assumed he was calling his insurance carrier. I assumed his carrier was going to ask him about the engineer's letter. I stood to the side and answered every question Morrison's team directed at me. I did not approach Karen. I did not address the board members who were standing in their yards making phone calls. I did not say anything to the neighbors who caught my eye. I let the paper speak. It had been doing that since the beginning. It didn't need my help now. The last thing Morrison said to me before he returned to the county vehicles was, "You maintained this permit and the associated documentation for 22 years. "I did," I said. He looked at the cut bank where Karen's backyard used to be. Then he looked back at my folder. 22 years is a long time to be right, he said. He wasn't being complimentary. He was just reading the record. The county's formal investigation opened on a Monday. I received the notification letter the same week Morrison filed his inspection report. The case number was the same one from the violation notice, 2024-CCA-0881, which meant the county was treating the demolition and the storm damage as a single continuous event, rather than two separate matters. That was significant. It meant every document in that chain, from the original permit to the certified warning letters to the violation notice the HOA had received and not acted on, was now part of a single official record. The investigation moved at the pace government investigations move. I didn't try to accelerate it. I answered every request for documentation promptly, provided copies of everything I had, and otherwise stayed out of the way. The first formal outcome arrived 6 weeks later. All HOA fines and compliance orders issued to me were voided in their entirety. The county's finding was direct. The seawall had been a valid, permitted coastal structure. My maintenance of it had been consistent and properly documented, and my non-compliance with the HOA's demolition order had been legally justified because the order itself exceeded the HOA's jurisdictional authority. I was at zero fault. The finding was in writing on county letterhead with a case number attached. I filed it in the fireproof box next to the original 1997 permit. The HOA received a formal coastal code violation fine for the unauthorized demolition. The board was placed under a county coastal oversight order. Any future decisions affecting permitted coastal structures in the community would require county pre-authorization before the board could act. The autonomy Karen had operated under for 4 years had a new set of hard limits on it. The civil claims came next. 7 property owners filed against the HOA for erosion damage to their rear lots. The amounts varied by the extent of each property's loss, but the aggregate was substantial. The HOA's insurance carrier opened an investigation into whether the policy covered damage arising from the board's own documented and warned against decision. The carrier's position, as I understood it from a neighbor whose attorney had spoken to theirs, was that coverage for self-inflicted damage caused in defiance of professional written warnings was not straightforward. The HOA's legal defense costs came from community reserves, which meant the neighbors who had stayed quiet through all of it were now paying for Karen's aesthetic vision in the most direct way possible. Karen and 2 board members faced personal liability exposure. The county's record showed they had voted to proceed with demolition after receiving Daniel Reyes's written engineering assessment, the one Karen had set face down on the table at the board meeting, the one Morrison had asked her about, while the neighborhood stood in their destroyed yards. Their attorneys were advising them. I didn't follow the details closely. That was their problem to manage. My accumulated fines were refunded in full. 14 months of $500 payments returned by check. I deposited it without ceremony. The community meeting came before most of the legal matters were resolved. It was not the kind of meeting Karen organized. No projector, no printed photographs, no lemonade. It was held on a Tuesday evening, and most of the neighborhood came. Karen resigned before the agenda reached her name. 3 board members followed. The 4th, the uncomfortable one, who had asked Morrison about personal liability, had already submitted his resignation in writing the previous week. Garrett, who had abstained from the original vote and said nothing when Karen cut him off, was elected to the new board. He called me the morning after the election. He didn't say much. He said, "We're going to fix this." I believed him. Margaret's written statement, her account of the 1995 and 1996 erosion events, the 6 feet of backyard Mrs. Henderson had lost, the 4 feet of clearance from the foundation, was cited in the county's final investigation summary as corroborating evidence of the seawall's documented protective function. An 81-year-old woman who had waited decades for someone to ask her what she knew had become part of the official record. The new board commissioned Daniel Reyes to design the replacement seawall. He used the original 1997 permit documentation as his engineering baseline. The county approved the new permit in 5 weeks, the fastest approval in the application's history, which I suspected had something to do with the case number already being in their system. Construction began on a Thursday morning in early spring. I was outside when they arrived. Not because I needed to be there, because I wanted to stand at my property line and watch it go up. The contractor's crew was professional and quiet. The county inspector arrived mid-morning and walked the line the same rear property line Morrison had walked with a measuring rod 4 months earlier. The new board members stood near the rear access gate. Nobody had a clipboard with printed photographs of eyesores. Nobody was measuring anything for aesthetic compliance. I stood at my property line and watched the first anchor forms go into the ground. At some point, I went inside and got my log. The one I had kept for 22 years, 4 stakes, same reference points every cycle. I walked to the waterline and took a reading. With the temporary erosion barriers in place and the new construction underway, the tidal mark was already returning toward the pre-demolition baseline, the same number I had recorded on the last calm morning before Karen arrived with her contractor and her clipboard and her certainty. I added a final entry. I wrote the date, the reading, and 3 words, "wall going back." Then I closed the log. I stood there for a while watching the crew work. The water behind them was sitting at its old level, reading the way it had read for 22 years before anyone had decided it needed an unobstructed view. Some views are worth blocking. I had known that the morning they tore the wall down. I had known it for 22 years before that. The difference was that now every homeowner on this block understood it too. Not because I had told them, but because the ocean had. The new wall went in over 3 weeks. When the final section was poured and cured, I walked the full length of it the way I always had, checking the grade, reading the anchor points, noting the water line against the concrete face at low tide. The number in my log matched the 2001 baseline, the year I bought the property, the year I inherited a wall someone else had built and decided it was worth keeping. I wrote that down too. Then I put the log back in the fireproof box, next to the 1997 permit, next to the county's finding that I had been at 0 fault, next to every certified letter and return receipt and notarized statement that had made up the case I never had to argue in a courtroom, because the ocean had argued it for me. I locked the box. Then I went inside and made coffee.